Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are in the world. But either way, happy Tuesday. It's not Monday, so at least we got over the beginning of the week a little bit. Alrighty, so I wanted to thank you all for joining me for a behavior analyst talks about freedom and choice from Professor Charles Catania. Thank you so much, Charlie, for doing this with us. And everybody, I wanted to let you know that during the next 100 minutes, so just about 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs. And the way you'll earn those CEUs is by staying the entire time of the webinar and by answering poll questions that are going to pop up on your screen. So you were emailed a join webinar button earlier, and that's how you should have been logged in here today. If you called in today, audio only, then please make sure that you do go to your email and use that button to join either on your tablet, phone, computer, whatever you want to use, even if you're having technical difficulties. The reason being is that if you've called in, dialed in only, then GoToWebinar cannot record your attendance and we'll have no idea that you're even here. So please make sure that even if you have to, even if you can't participate through that other device, you just still join so this way we at least have record that you joined us. Alrighty. If you needed a general certificate of attendance and you don't need CEUs, then you will get a certificate a couple of hours after we end here today, and that's completely free. But if you need CEUs, you can go ahead and purchase them in the store, and I will be looking at your poll and attendance data tomorrow, and will be emailing you instructions on how to access your certificates then. But alrighty, I think that's all I have to say for right now, so I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Charlie.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, this is part of our continuing series of Behavior Analyst talks about all kinds of different things, and the topic for this time is freedom and choice. And I'll get into a little bit more in details about that. I'll point out to you that if you look at the handouts, there are two things you can download. One of them is a PDF version of these slides you're going to be seeing, and the other is one particular article I'll be mentioning, which has a couple of things in it you might want to look at, and I'll talk about that at the time we get to that. Some of what I'll be talking about is drawn from my textbook, which is called The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. And I just wanted to point out here that if any of you have any interest in this particular book, there's the website for the publisher, and the publisher will give 10% discount and free shipping for those who go by the URL that's there at the bottom of that page. No further ado, though, let's move on, because what we want to talk about is the topic. Freedom, and I'm specifically said here free choice, not a forced choice, not a thing where there's just one thing you have to pick. And just to summarize overall what we're going to be talking about today, there are all sorts of definitions of freedom. They range from definitions that appeal to minimizing coercion, and then there are those that concentrate on philosophical issues, such as distinguishing between freedom and determinism. We'll be talking a little bit about all of those things, and we'll also be talking about the whole vocabulary of freedom. One of the things we'll want to do here is also talk about where this verbal behavior comes from. What are the kinds of things we have to see in a situation where some person, perhaps, or maybe it's even a pigeon or rat, if some organism is interacting with the environment, what do we have to see in that behavior? What do most individuals have to see to say, that's volitional, that's just not something that's just totally determined by the stimuli and all. It's not Pavlovian stuff. And to what extent do the features of those situations determine whether we call it volitional or not? One of the things I'll spend a good bit of time on is to ask about whether it's a reinforcer to be allowed access to opportunities to make a choice. And that's an empirical question. Do we prefer to have options as opposed to just having a single thing to to do. And some people have argued that that it's aversive to have options, but we'll talk a little bit about where those kinds of things come from and about those kinds of vocabularies. And along the way, this became a particularly fraught issue when Skinner published a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And probably most of you, one time or another, have heard of the debate between, well, not to debate, but the interactions involving Chomsky's review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. Well, Chomsky also, when Beyond Freedom and Dignity came out, did a review of that book for the New York Review of Books, and it too was a highly critical review. And we'll be talking a little bit about that one as well as some of these other issues. So the book came out in '71. And although it sounds like it might be about those issues, there are a couple of things that recently have been coming out. There's a book by Sapolsky, which is about determinism, and several kinds of books lately that have become, let's see, Sapolsky's about free agents, and we see these things coming and going in the general literature and trade books all the time. Well, Skinner's was a book like that. It came out. It was not a book to be used as a textbook, but he was setting out his position with respect to the language of freedom. And probably some of that was in response to the idea that we behavior analysts are always talking about control of behavior and limiting options and so forth. And probably one of the issues involved in determining you doing that was to respond to these inappropriate ways of talking about behavior analysis. But he wasn't really concerned about this whole question of determinism. You know, are the things that you're going to be doing next totally determined by everything we know about the world? Is there such a thing as free will? Instead, what Skinner did was he examined what he called the literature of freedom, and the kinds of things that were around in the writings of folks leading up to the American Revolution and the various other kinds of major political events over the course of the human history. And he talked about freedom as being the inverse of coercion. You could be forced to do things, or you could do things without somebody standing behind you and being ready to damage you in some way if you don't follow orders or follow instructions. So, quoting from his book, what we call the literature of freedom has been designed to induce people to escape from or attack those who control them aversively. That's a quotation from Skinner's book. Now, coercion necessarily limits choices. If you're told you have to do something, you're coerced into doing something, that means that you don't have alternatives. You've got to do that thing that you're being told to do. So an implicit freedom of implicit feature of this kind of freedom is that the alternative to that is having the capacity to choose, to have options. And so if you look up dictionary definitions of freedom, it sometimes explicitly comes up as the capacity to exercise choice, free will. Well, free will doesn't sound like a behavioral concept, nor does volition, but we'll at least be able to talk about it if we want to take the direction that we behavior analysts usually take, which is let's ask about this and as some verbal behavior, and let's ask about what then sets the occasion for this sort of verbal behavior. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about freedom and determinism. The capacity for free choice, and it's often linked to free will, but if you have a preference for an opportunity to choose, that doesn't say anything about whether once you get in a situation where you have a choice, whether those choices are free or determined. In fact, I'm going to be later talking about cases in which the choices are highly determined. If you have two alternatives, like a pigeon standing in a chamber in front of two keys and it can peck either one, there are circumstances in which we can predict with very, very high likelihood that the pigeon is going to peck this one and not that one. And so in that sense, that choice can be said to be highly determined. Both the environment and the history, the pigeon's history with respect to pecking those keys are such that we know that this response is the one that's likely to occur and not the other one. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether the pigeon would prefer to be in that kind of a situation as opposed to one in which there's only one key there. And so we want to talk about those kinds of preferences. In fact, when we talk about things like, well, do you go to the restaurant where you have a choice of different menus, or do you go to the restaurant that specializes in just one or two things? When we behavior analysts get interested in things of that sort, we end up looking at what we call concurrent chains. We look at two responses which are a bit like knocking on the doors of two different rooms. You can make one response and it'll get you into one situation. The other response will get you into the other situation. Those two responses are available at the same time or concurrently, but they are chains, each of which leads to this second situation. And we can ask whether knocking on one door or knocking on the other door is preferred, which means that the conditions they produce, we can talk about the preference of those conditions they produce. And we're going to look a little bit at data from those kinds of situations later. Let's go back a little bit to Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity. He posited the possibility that that the opportunity for choice was actually something that had evolved over time, that we've been selected, that individuals that have opportunities for choice or prefer opportunities for choice might have advantages over those that don't. And so he wrote, it is possible that man's genetic and he wrote man back in the 70s instead of humans. And by the way, if you go back far enough, that word was a gender neutral word, but in more recent times it has not become that so. It is possible that man's genetic endowment supports this kind of struggle for freedom. He made this point mainly because he was concerned with freedom as escape from aversive contingencies. And as I already quoted, essentially, what we call the literature of freedom has been designed to induce people to escape from or attack those who act to control them aversively. And he goes on to say, the importance of this literature of freedom can scarcely be questioned. This can hardly be taken as an argument that a behavior analytic approach leans toward fascism, but that's the kind of implication that Chomsky drew from this book. We'll again mention that. We're not going to spend too much time on that, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Well, so this by way of introduction, and let's see if you folks were following this, because let's give you some practice on answering a poll question. Here it comes. Marissa, over to you.
Alrighty, everybody. So Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, was mainly about. Go ahead and choose the best answer. Please make sure you do participate in these polls if you need CEUs. They are required. If you get the answer wrong, it won't count against you, but please do try to get it right, so this way Professor Catania knows which direction to go in with the audience, or with the presentation, and he knows where you stand. If you don't need CEUs, please feel free to participate in these polls anyways. They're kind of fun sometimes. And if you have any trouble using the interface that should have popped up on your screen, then go ahead and write your answer in either a Word document or an email, and you could send that to me after the webinar with all your answers, and that will perfectly suffice for participation. Okay, so let's shut this one down. It looks like 15% say determinism, 22% say free will, 50% say freedom versus coercion, and 13% say choice.
Well, fortunately, the majority got it right. It's interesting that you mentioned the possibility that they could be fun. I guess in some future one, I'm going to have a question like toward the end of the session, which of the poll questions included a pun in it? something. Well, anyway, let's not worry about that. That's for another time. Let's get back to the topics at hand. And let me talk a little bit about free choice versus forced choice. Okay, as I said earlier, whatever else is involved in our concept of freedom, if you don't have alternatives, how could you be free to choose? An organism that doesn't have any opportunity to choose among alternatives couldn't possibly be called free. So if you have alternatives available, we call that free choice. So an example would be a pigeon can produce food by picking either of two keys. I used that as an example just a little bit ago. When only a single key is available, it produces the same kind of food, the same amount of food, then we say the pigeon's got a forced choice. There's only one thing you can do. And so the question is, given the opportunity to enter free choice or forced choice situations, what will pigeons prefer? Well, what I'm going to show is some data that strongly imply that pigeons prefer the free choices over the forced choices. What's even, and then there's some other interesting side effects of this. Actually, if you increase the number of alternatives, if you then have, instead of 1 versus 2, you have 1 versus 3 or 1 versus 4, there actually is a somewhat not quite so big a preference. And some folks have called that overchoice and have argued that that's one of the reasons why in contemporary culture we've got a problem, that we've got too many choices. Another one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the extent to which this preference is learned. If it's not learned, that has very different implications than that we've learned over the course of our lives, that it's always better to have backups, and that's why we come to prefer choices. And I'm going to just, since I'm in the appropriate screen here, I've got to fix the spelling of that word in the last line. Let's look at some research. Okay. I'm going to talk about a chamber. This goes back to one of the earliest versions of some experiments that I was involved in early on. Frankly, I do not remember exactly what led me to do these experiments long enough ago. But we have a chamber here. This is the wall of the chamber at which the, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Back here. Okay, this is the wall of the chamber at which the pigeon's looking, and there are these six circles. Each of them represents a pigeon key, something with lit up from behind at which the pigeon can peck. And we've got 6 of them here. The bottom ones are going to be our initial links. They will just light up. I'll show you a little bit more in the details of the procedure. They are the doors upon which the pigeon knocks in order to get into the other situations. The left one, it knocks on that door by pecking that key, and it will get into the situation where it has a choice between 2 keys, say blue or amber. Pecks on the bottom right key, and knocking on that door, figuratively, gets it in a situation where it has a choice between a green, 2 keys, green and red. That at least is one possible way you can set this up. So this is the kind of chamber that the pigeon's looking at. It pecks on one of the bottom initial link keys. Depending upon which it pecks, it gets into one of these 2 situations shown at the top, either this one, the blue amber on the left, or the green red on the right. Once it gets there, it works on those 2 keys until it produces food. And then once the food has been delivered, it comes back to the initial link. So you go back through the cycle. Now, we can't use the amount of pecking on the terminal links to tell us whether what its preferences are. If it happens for some reason, rather the bird pecks, say, the blue and amber keys a lot more than it pecks the green and red keys, we still don't know whether the bird would prefer that, because we don't know how often the pigeon would get itself into those situations by knocking on the doors, say. And to give you a pretty obvious example, if the initial link keys, if the left one got a bird into a situation where it's responding to produce food according to a ratio schedule, which will lead it to peck very fast. The ratio schedule on the average VR10, on the average every 10th response was reinforced. Look at the pigeon just pecking away at a high rate. If, on the other hand, in the presence of a green or red, we reinforced pecks there, maybe we could even go on a DRL schedule in which we require that the reinforcer depend on the pigeon pecking and then waiting at least a number of seconds. And there we're going to get much slower pecking. Well, still, it just might be that even though one is fast pecking and the other is slow pecking, the pigeon might prefer to get into the situation where it can earn its food by pecking slowly over one in which it has to peck fast, or it is driven to peck fast by the contingencies. So we need to look at the initial links. They have to be separate from those terminal links. It's which door the pigeon knocks on, which of these initial link keys the bird pecks, that get it into these alternative situations that tell us what its preferences are. Now, here's an example of the experiment we're going to do. Okay, and actually notice that I dropped out the red key on this example. So here are the initial link keys, and let's say the bird pecks, and we usually set up a variable interval schedule. On the average, as time passes, every so many seconds, pecks on this one will produce the new situation, knocks on this door, we'll get the pigeon here. And also on the other one, on the average, after so many seconds, equal to the one in the other key, but they don't come up at the same time, the bird can get into this condition shown on the right. So now look at what we have here. Bird pecks on this left initial link, and it gets in a situation where it has a blue key and an amber key, and all the other keys are dark. And of course, we have to do our controls. We switch the positions of the blue and amber. That's just a technicality, actually. The important point for our purposes is that it doesn't matter which of these two keys the pigeon pecks. At the end of a fixed interval, at the end of so many seconds, its next peck produces food. So it gets either lit key, and it comes back again to the situation where it's got the two white keys to peck again. On the other hand, if pecking on the right key does something, it gets it into a situation where only one key is lit. It's a green key, and it could be on the left or right. Again, so we randomly move them back and forth. But there's only one way to get food. And after the bird, at the end of the same fixed interval, after the bird gets food, it comes back to this situation. And so we get the bird going through the cycles of pecking on these keys and getting into one of these and then coming back, and then pecking on these keys, getting to either one of these again, coming back. And we look at what the pigeon does over a period of time, and we ask, does the bird peck more on the left key? Does it knock on that door more often to get at the free choice than it does to produce the forced choice? And I won't keep you in suspense. Here we have a graph that shows you the kind of data you can get. These are data from 3 different pigeons taken over a long series of variations involving positions and colors and so forth, various things to control for. And to make it easier to follow this, as we have keys on the left and on the right, we're asking a preference for what's on the left, a preference on what's on the right. Well, we put the responding then down on the x-axis here, so that if the data point goes to the left, it means a preference for what's on the left key. If the data point goes to the right, it's a preference for what's on the right key. So we start with a baseline in which both of the terminal links are the same, just to see where we start from. And then we put the choice on the left. That's what the triangle pointing to the left is. So here the choice is on the left, and we find that the proportion of responses on the left initially move to the left here, meaning that the bird is preferring that. And then we switch to the choice being available only by pecks on the right key, and the responding comes back the other way. And if you look and see, as we switch back from being on the left, being on the right, being on the left, being on the right, these switches back and forth means that whenever there are 2 keys available, that's what the pigeon knocks on the door to get at more often. That's the initial link key the pigeon pecks more often. And so we don't really need statistics, fancy statistics. If you just ask what's the probability it'll go one way or another, there's a 50-50 chance it'll go either way here, and a 50-50 chance here and here. So the odds that it will follow this, so what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, Well, you multiply 0.5 and raise it to the 10th power. That's a pretty small probability. And all of the birds are doing that essentially, although it's a little noisier in some cases than others. Over all of these things, oh yeah, there are a couple of cases you can argue not too much happens, but so, but the other thing to notice is, by the way, we're talking about a relatively small shift. If you're talking about less than 10%, this is the equivalent of making one key, one terminal link, favoring the other a little bit by maybe an increase in 5 or 10% in the number of reinforcers that are given. So compared to what you can get in preferences for different amounts of food, it's not a big deal, but it's there and it's there all the time. Okay, well, okay, but now what really makes a choice? Suppose we have two keys, each correlated with reinforcers, and we pit them against two keys, only one of them are correlated with reinforcers. In the example I showed you in this experiment, the green key was accompanied by a dark key. But we could ask, maybe it's something, maybe there's just two pretty lights here, blue and amber. Well, by the way, these experiments go back to the days that we used to light the keys up by having some Christmas tree lights behind the bulbs. So these are pretty Christmas tree colors. And so if we had green and red here as the Christmas tree colors, maybe that would cancel out this preference. So we ended up doing more research to get at that. Then, you know, you've always got these choices embedded in the context of that whole panel here. This whole panel, it's got a lot of area on it. The bird could peck anywhere on here. And we happen to have set things up so the bird tends to peck on these keys, but what if the pigeon pecked just around the keys, just outside them? Would those count as choices as well? If the question is whether whether more behavior is available in some choice than others, maybe we should look at two keys versus a single key that was bigger, so that two keys match the single bigger key in area. Does that create a preference? Or maybe we should be looking at the circumference, because when we do an experiment in a pigeon chamber, the birds tend to peck around the edges of the key. If you see my cursor here, they don't tend to peck on the middle all the time. Nowadays, people do these experiments with touch screens, and they can actually record the locations of pecks. We used to just have to watch them, but it was always pretty clear that the pigeons tended to peck at boundaries. So maybe that's important. So maybe we should do some experiments pitting two keys against a single key with the same area. What I will show you is that whenever we do these kinds of experiments, number always wins out. 2 versus 1 is what matters. Free choice depends not just on the availability of an area of pecking or something like that. It depends on the availability of more than one response class that's maintained by reinforcers. And this is going to turn out to be significant. It's going to depend on the number of available operands. Again, let's look at some research. Here's another experiment. This is one I did with my colleague Terje Sagfolden from Norway, who came and visited and worked with me from the University of Oslo on 3 different occasions, actually. Here again, we have our 6 keys, but the initial link pecks on the left key can produce 3 reds and a green, and the initial link pecks on the right key produce 3 greens and a red. Whoops, we got a problem here with I hope I won't have to reboot. Now the thing here is that what we have here is 4 pretty colors in each case. And so so we can't attribute preference for one or the other to a preference for color. Here are some of the data. Sorry about this, but I'm having a problem in my system here that I hope will not be a. Here again, you can see that again we have the arrows tending to point in the direction of the free choice preference, and I will show you here on the one where you can see this, that Preference shifts over to the left when the free choice is on the left. And then when we move free choice over to the right, then preference moves to the right. And what these different conditions are were things where we looked at, for example, the position at which the bird pecked the most often on those 4 keys. I have to ask you a question, Marissa. If I log off and log in again, will that be okay? Because I think that's the only way I'm going to get rid of this problem. So I think it'll be something that I can do fairly quickly, and we may lose a minute or two.
Yeah, no
And let me do this. Let me put up the. Let me see if I can quickly. Whoops. Why did you do? Well, no, you can't do poll test. Can you do poll question 2 even if you don't have my screen there?
Yeah, I could still
Can you?
do the poll and I'll just leave it up while you're gone.
You're doing the poll question. I'm going to reboot my computer. Sorry
Okay.
about this, folks, and then I'll log right back in. Okay. Here we go. Okay. I'll get back on as quickly as I can.
Sounds good. All right, everybody, go ahead. Take some time to do the poll while we try to get everything situated. Sorry about the technical difficulties really quick. Thank you all for voting. I'm just going to leave it up for a couple of minutes until he gets back. Extended poll time. Also, if you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the questions box. I might have forgotten to mention that earlier in my intro, but go ahead, put them in the questions box and we will have some time for Q&A. Dr. Catania loves, 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 loves to answer questions. Amazing. Thank you all for voting so far. Alrighty, let's see. Go ahead and take a vote on this one, even if you don't need CEUs or anything like that. Let's see if we can get 100% participation by the time that Dr. Catania comes back.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Welcome.
Can you hear me and see me?
I can.
Hello.
Oh, I can hear you. I don't see you yet.
Let's see. Share my webcam. Okay. Here we go.
There we go. I'm gonna stop sharing the poll.
Okay. Okay.
Awesome. And then I'm gonna
At
make you
least I'm.
to start sharing your screen again.
Okay. Let me clean up some other stuff that's on the desktop that came up. Share my screen. Here we go. I'll get rid of that. Yeah. How's that?
Awesome. Great. And here's
Okay.
the results of the poll question.
Okay.
Looks like research on the free choice shows 13% said preference for free choice, 83% said preference for free choice, 1% said indifference, and 3% said inclusion outcomes, or inconclusive outcomes, sorry.
Okay. Excellent, folks. Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's see. So that was, oh, whoops. Got to get back to where we were in this thing. So we're talking about this particular experiment. The other thing we were able to do in this experiment was look at, there were difference in rates depending upon which key the bird pecked. In this case, for example, a peck on any of the 3 green keys would produce food at the end of the fixed interval. Peck on the red key did not ever produce food. And this one, there was only a single green key. Pecks on any of the 3 red keys didn't produce food. But what we would find is that the birds would peck more on some keys than on others. And so we did things like put the red key in the position which the bird was had showed the highest rate during the times when the key was green, and things of that sort, in order to control for amount of pecking. And here's some more data of different kinds of things. These are data obtained over several different experiments over time and sort of average, but it tends to show that although there are some birds that tend to increase their preferences where the number of alternatives increases, by and large, most birds show that as the preferences go from 2 to 3 to 4, their rates come down. It would be nice to have somebody do that, do this kind of research and look at that in more detail. Just to keep on moving along, since we lost a little time, let me quickly summarize. This is a series of experiments in which we looked at key area, key size, and various arrangements of that sort. And it does come out that pretty much over time, if you look at this, there's a little bit of variability, but the free choice preference remains, in that you see the data moving in the direction of the arrow in most cases. And when you're just looking at size, small versus large, you don't see consistent preferences. And then another question is, what kinds of reinforcers matter here? Does it matter that the alternatives are all the same? These are some data involving an experiment in which the initial links were instead in a chamber where the white keys were in the middle, and the bird either could peck on the left key, which I've labeled A here, and pecks there would produce food, or it could peck on the right key and there it could produce water. And the question is, given the choice between the food key and the water key, would the bird prefer to have both keys available as opposed to having just one or the other? Well, the curious thing there is, it was a tough experiment to do, but you'll notice that here, starting out from baseline, the birds ended up, the arrows are pointing that way. Then when we shift back to the arrows pointing the other way, they come over in that direction, then they go back the other way. It's a kind of a not the greatest outcome, but the other thing is that during much of this time, it turns out that if you give birds an opportunity to eat or drink, they will usually eat first and drink afterwards. The analog to that, for those of you who are familiar with the rat literature, is a phenomenon called polydipsia. Rats, if you give them food, will drink after eating, and birds seem to do the same sort of thing. So during the data that were collected, well, we have these markers here. These are cases in which the bird was always choosing food. So whether it got into the forced choice or the free choice, it was only ever choosing one of those. Well, that raises the question, does it matter? Imagine you got two restaurants, okay? Both of them make a dish you like so much. I mean, they make this lasagna that just such that if you go to this restaurant, you're always going to order the lasagna. Now, one of those two restaurants just specializes in lasagna. It makes only that dish. The other one makes the lasagna, but it has a full menu of other offerings. Everything else being equal, which restaurant do you go to? And when I've tried this question on folks, mostly they say, yeah, I want to go to the one with the full menu. Every time you go, you're still going to pick your favorite dish, but it's nice to know the other ones are there, isn't it? Can we do an experiment on that? Well, actually, the embarrassing thing for me about this experiment I'm going to tell you about is I was in a recent Zoom discussion with some colleagues, and we were talking about free choice. I was beginning to make my preparations for this talk. And I said, I just have an idea for how to do the experiment to check that, to create a preference in which one of the alternatives in the preferences is virtually never chosen. And I just realized how to do that. And I finished the Zoom call and went and sort of looked at things. And then I discovered I had done the experiment already. How embarrassing. But anyway, here's the experiment, okay? This time we have 5 keys. And the initial links are these two bottom ones. So you peck on the left one and you produce one set of conditions, you peck on the right one. Here are the two sets of conditions. The top ones here with yellow and red are one alternative produced by pecks on the left key. You knock on that door to get this condition. You knock on the other door and you get simply a reversal. And that's just to get a baseline, to see what happens. When you've got these keys, what happens is you have a random interval, you have a 40-second fixed interval schedule. The pecks on these other keys are random interval 40 seconds. Don't worry about those details. These are the keys. We look at how often the birds peck on these keys, and whether they peck more on one than more on the other means they're knocking more often on that door, which means they prefer one of these to the other. Then we give the birds some separate training. Okay, that's phase 2 here. And in phase 2, I'm not even bothering showing you the initial ink condition. I'm just showing you what they get. They get, and this comes on without their having to do any pecking on the bottom keys. These, all that happens is these three keys come on with green. These three keys come on and yellow is either on the left or the right. These three keys come on and red is either on the left or the right. When the key comes on green, it's a fixed interval 20 seconds. It's a short fixed interval. When the key comes on yellow and the bird pecks on that key, it's going to be a 40-second fixed interval. And when the key comes on red, it's extinction. The key comes on for 40 seconds and then just turns off. So we've got a short fixed interval in the middle key. If instead the outside key comes on and it's yellow, it's going to be a 40-second fixed interval. And if the red key comes on, it's going to be extinction. And we run that for a while, for a bunch of sessions, until we see the bird pecks on the green in the short fixed interval, it pecks on the yellow in the long fixed interval, and it pretty much stops pecking on red. And now we go to our test. This is when we want to see what happens. Now we put the bird in the situation where it's got to show its preference. It pecks on the white keys. And what does it get? It either gets green in the center with yellow on one of the two sides, or green in the center with red on one of the two sides. Now look what those conditions are. If it's green and yellow, it's a 20-second fixed interval and a 40-second fixed interval. One is a short one, one's a long time. What do you guess the pigeon does there? If the pigeon has a short time to reinforcement, 20 seconds on the green key, and a long time to reinforcement, it won't be till 40 seconds that the peck on that key produces food. Guess what the bird does? It always starts pecking on the green, and it ends up producing that reinforcer. And once it's produced that reinforcer, it comes back into the initial links again. It hardly ever pecks the yellow key because it doesn't bother pecking on the key in which the reinforcers won't come up for a long while. You put it in, it peck on the other key now, produce green with either red on the left or the right. And what does the bird do there? Well, it starts pecking on that 20-second fixed interval. And since the red's an extinction key, it doesn't peck there either. So you've got a bird who gets into these terminal links. And if it's green-yellow, it pecks just the green key. If it's green-red, it pecks just the green key. This is like always picking the same item on the menu, even though the restaurant has other things on the menu. And what kinds of data did we get? Well, this shows the baseline we start with, and you switch to green, yellow, where yellow is the longer FI, and red is extinction, and the bird is pecking only on the green keys, and this bird's preference shift over toward the choice. The yellow, even though the bird is never pecking yellow, this bird too shifts over in that direction. This bird too shifts over in that direction. And this bird also shifts over in that direction. So these are the three conditions. These are the three stages of these experiments: the baseline, the FI training, and the free choice test, shown in the three phases. This is the baseline in which we get the birds just responding to look at its preference for the stimuli. And then we do the training, and we're not giving the bird the opportunity to choose at that point. Then we come back to the choice situation where it responds to the white keys to show which situation is the preferable one. And we see the preference shift for the free choice. So you go to the restaurant that has the more variable menu, even though you always pick your favorite dish. This means that we can't appeal to whether or not you respond on both of them as a basis for choosing, and that has implications. It can't just be the number of keys or something like that. It has to be operant classes, classes that have been created by reinforcers. It has to be operants. And this is why the concept of the operant then becomes significant when we want to talk about issues in freedom. Well, there was enough in this. Let's see if any of this, whether you can answer a question about some of this. There was a lot of material in there. So let's try it with this one.
Alrighty, everybody. Go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Whether a free choice is provided to pigeons depends on.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you all for voting so quickly. Alrighty, let's shut this down. And it looks like 17% said number of keys, 67% said number of available operants, 17% said stimuli, and nobody said total area for pecking.
Good, good, good. Thank you, those of you who picked the number of operants. I mean, that's really, as far as I'm concerned, a really significant kind of thing. The operant is more than just, you know, a convenient a convenience for us. It is fundamental. If you've got to have choices, you've got to have different operant classes, and that's what really makes a choice. Well, let's move on from there, because I mean, we're talking about the availability of choices. What about this language of freedom? I mean, can we relate it to any of the other issues about freedom that have been involved in political issues and so on? Let's talk a bit. And this may seem like a real jump to a different kind of topic, but I'm going to try to show you how this is related to some of the other things we've been worrying about. Researcher named Barry Schwartz back in the 80s, actually he arrived at this stuff from a political position. Barry started out as a student of operant behavior. He went on and got his Ph.D. at Penn, and was involved presumably in behavior analysis, but underneath it all, he was always he actually was skeptical about the behavioral approach, and in fact, he eventually became the department chair at Swarthmore College. And when he was there, he wrote an editorial or a piece for the Swarthmore Alumni Bulletin, in which he said that when he was a student, he read Skinner's Walden 2, and maybe he read Beyond Freedom and Dignity too, and he was appalled by what it implied about behavior. He was appalled by the notion of control and by the behavioral approach, and so he figured he had to learn enough about it to critique it. He was an undergraduate without telling his teachers that he was starting with this position, and he went on after he had finished his degree to do an experiment in which he had pigeons. They had 2 keys, and they had an array, which was a 4x4 square of lights. And the light started in the upper left corner, and if the bird pecked the right key, the lights moved across the row horizontally. If it pecked the left key, the lights moved down the array vertically. So by pecking first the right key and then the left key, the bird could eventually get the key to move, the lights to move across and then down. And the reinforcer was delivered when the bird got the light down to the lower right corner. So essentially, what the birds ended up doing was to make 4 right pecks, 4 left pecks, 4 or make several right pecs and several left pecs, they virtually never or very infrequently made a couple of rights and a couple of lefts and moved the lights down along the diagonal, which is another way they could have done it. And he published this paper as a critique of the concept of reinforcement itself. And he made the case that all reinforcement does is produce stereotypy, and that's a bad thing. So when the pigeon's pecks on the left and the right keys drove a light from the upper left to the lower right part of the array, the pigeons came to produce just a few stereotype sequences among a large variety of possible options. There are a lot of ways they could have done it. There are a lot of sequences of lefts and rights. And this became part of the literature. Well, Alan Nuringer at Reed College was bothered a bit by this experiment and recognized that one of the things about this was that the visual array constrained the kinds of sequences that you could have. The bird didn't have any way of moving things around in different ways. So he and one of his students, Page, ended up doing an experiment in which, and let me check something. I just, yeah, by the way, with this, for a moment, I thought maybe I had misspelled Page's name, but didn't. Okay. They did an experiment in which the pigeon just had two keys, and I don't recall whether they made it exactly 8 pecks to correspond to the sequence in Schwartz's study. But first they looked at the variability they got if they required that the bird produce a sequence that had various numbers in it. But another thing they decided to look at eventually was that what if the reinforcer depended upon this sequence this time being different from the sequence last time? And it turned out that it was very easy to do that. So their experiment showed that the reinforcers could maintain highly variable behavior. In fact, it was very easy to do. It was easier to teach variable responding than it was to teach a fixed sequence like left, 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 right, right, left, left, left. Variable responding, Page and Nuringer showed, was that was a dimension of behavior. It was an operant class that could be reinforced. You could shape that up. In the meantime, there were other things we were learning. Working with dolphins, we had novel sequences being produced by dolphins in marine world places. If you just reinforced in every session something different from what the dolphin or what the porpoise had done the time before, people were showing variability in shaping, but this was one in which you could quantify it. And the beautiful thing about it was that it was easy to do. Shaping variability was easy to do. And isn't that interesting? Because you need to have variability if you're going to have shaping. Variability for us is necessary for behavior changing within the lifetime of the individual organism or evolving, just as variability is essential if you're going to have evolution in species over time in the Darwinian selection. So you can't have selection without variation. You've got, one depends upon the other being there. I still find it really, really significant that Schwartz ended up doing faulted experiment, or at least derived faulty conclusions from it, mainly because he was coming at it from a political perspective. He wanted to find certain kinds of things, and that's what he came up finding, rather than looking at what the data showed and taking it from there. He went and did some other experiments as well, some of which involved human verbal behavior, and again argued that reinforcement produced stereotypy, when in fact what he was looking at was stereotypy produced by human verbally governed behavior. And he ended up writing some trade books in which he criticized Skinner and Darwin and other approaches. He called it the battle for human nature. We have some more hopeful things to say and I think what followed from those political directions. Now, there's a strange thing about variability. No single response by itself could possibly be variable. It's only variable because it's part of an extended sequence in which the earlier responses are varying. If they'd all been the same, if it was, say, if you had 4 levers that a rat could press, and it ended up always pressing the leftmost one, and all the previous responses were ones on the left, you could reinforce responding on the left lever. But if what you're asking the rat to do now to produce food is to give you a different sequence of presses on the 4 levers every time. So if this time it presses 1, 3, 2, and 4, then next time it can't produce that sequence. It has to produce 2, 4, 3, 1, and the next time a different one again. They are only novel by reference to the ones that have already occurred. So this is the reinforcer acting on a population extended over time. And if there was ever a case in which we were forced to say, look, the reinforcer isn't just an instantaneous event acting upon a response that just happened. The reinforcer is acting on this response, and it's also acting on the sequence, and it's acting on this sequence in the context of the last sequence and the one before that and the one before that. Only if that's the case, only if the reinforcer can operate in such a way that it is influenced by all of the sequence that came before, could we get these kinds of results. So a given response can be variable in one context, it could be stereotyped in another. And these are the findings, as I've just been saying, that draw us once again to the conclusion that organisms are sensitive to populations of responses and consequences that occur over extended times, that you can't talk about individual stimulus response contiguities. It is significant. What did Page and Nuringer entitle their article? They called it Variability is an Operant. This is a response class that you can create with differential reinforcement. And when you have variability, this provides the variations upon which selection depends. This is crucial. This is at the heart of all that we do. And choice is implicit in it. You've got to have alternatives to be able to behave variably. You can't behave variably if you have just one option. You've got to have many. So now, how about volition, will, variability? How about these terms? They come from a common etymology. The VOL part and will come from earlier roots in Old English and eventually Latin and so forth. And the word voluntary too. These have been crucial words in our history. You know, that we've sometimes talked about reflex behavior as being involuntary and operant behavior being voluntary. That's really a strange kind of usage. You know, how voluntary is it if that someone will pick up, sees a $100 bill lying on the street? You can say that's operant behavior and it's voluntary, but the probability of somebody picking it up if they happen to see it there and nobody else, it's not clear that anybody else is around who might have just dropped it, the probability of picking up is probably pretty high. So anyway, all these words derive from the Latin velle, to wish or to want. We might as well consider them synonymous, but they all imply that options are available. And so therefore they also imply that that there is an opportunity for variability. And now let me be clear about what we got going here. We're not talking about whether there's something inside us called our will or our volition or something like that. We're now looking at verbal behavior. We watch the ongoing behavior of some organism. We see what it's doing. It does this, it does that, it does something a little bit different now than it does before. And somebody asks us, how would you describe the behavior of that animal? or we ask just anybody, not a psychologist necessarily, not a behavior analyst, and they say, oh, that does look like voluntary behavior. Our question now is, what are the properties of behavior that lead us to respond that way? And those of you who are familiar with the language of verbal behavior, if you're watching this behavior in an experimental chamber, or you're watching the behavior of a child, what properties of the rat's behavior in the chamber, the pigeon's behavior in its chamber, the child playing with toys, what properties of their behavior are the ones that are the properties that lead you to tact that kind of behavior as voluntary behavior? It's an experiment. It's a question about where this language originates. And then we do these experiments and we try to create different kinds of things in the lab. And we know that we call things by certain names, certain kinds of behavior by certain names when we see them out there in the real world, out there in the wild, so to speak. And then we build things in the laboratory and we show them to people and they say, what would you call this? And if we get the people who are looking at this calling them by the same name, oh yeah, that's voluntary behavior, just as the child's behavior was voluntary, then we've got a little bit of a handle on what features go into creating our vocabularies. This is the way into all of those philosophical things. We're asking about the origins of our verbal behavior. And it's tough because it's not just one thing there. It's not something that you can have sitting there, present easily as a stimulus. It's one thing to present the color red or the color green. It's another thing to show an organism responding one way and an organism responding the other way, and to teach somebody that, oh, you call this behavior voluntary, you call this behavior elicited, you call that behavior coerced. Those are items of the everyday vocabulary too, and we can only address them by looking at situations that are going to have fuzzy boundaries. Obviously, these things have been built in a long human history. Underlying it all, though, has to be that the availability of options is key to some of the distinctions we make. Okay, given all that, again, complicated stuff, let's have another poll question.
Okay, everybody. Go ahead and answer this one. Thank you all for voting so quickly. I'm going to shut this down in just a second. Thank you. Alrighty. Looks like 74% said variability can be reinforced. 2% said rats prefer forced choice. 25% said reinforcement produces stereotypy. And nobody said pigeons prefer forced choice.
Good. And the majority has it, but actually I can't fault the people that picked reinforcement produces stereotypy, because in fact, in the particular experiment that that Schwartz did, that was actually the result he got. He got it because he designed the experiment in a certain way, but it was an outcome, and therefore that was not a well-constructed question. So, because it, but anyway, so, but for me, the more important point is that Page and Erdinger found that variability as a response class could be reinforced. Okay, moving on from that now, let's get on to some of the this more to volition. We have more that we can say about it. So I've already talked a little bit about how we could try to design procedures in which we show somebody, a rat working in a chamber with a number of levers to press and so forth, or a pigeon with a number of keys to peck, or a child playing with toys and all. And we could ask them about how certain bits of verbal behavior could be the ones that now identify what's going on. In other words, could be our tacts, our ways of providing names for these different kinds of classes of behavior. Well, Nuringer actually looked, and his colleagues, particularly students working with him at Reed College, explored these verbal dimensions, because instead of just looking at the kinds of situations you're in the laboratory, they created things like computer-generated things for their observers, students serving in their experiments, could look at, of objects moving around and interacting with each other, bouncing off each other. And they arranged various kinds of features to that, whether it was something that some little blob did was reliably followed by something happening, and so on. You know, cartoons are like that. Somebody designs a bunch of stuff moving around, and we look at it, and yeah, if Mickey Mouse does something and something happens, we would probably talk about Mickey Mouse in a certain ways and Mickey's behavior, even though all we had was a bunch of squiggles on a screen. You know, the Mickey Mouse really isn't there behind the screen doing anything. It's just a thing that's created, but we would name some of the things that happen. Well, he asked them to judge whether these computer-generated things were demonstrating inner control, were generating goal directedness, were generating predictability, and found that the more likely they were to label these kinds of things that the subjects have been observing as involving inner control, as involving goal directedness, as involving predictability, the more those things came together, the more likely they'd also call them volitional. Remember, no real organism is behaving here. These are just computer-generated things. In other words, the stimulus properties that were setting the occasion for verbal responses or tacting involving words like volition were things you could measure and manipulate. In other words, they were coming up with ways of actually studying what the dimensions are of those properties. And if you see similar things going on in the part of a real organism, then you've got, now it's not telling us how we learn that stuff, but it's telling us something about where these judgments come from. And once you see them as having their sources in the stimulus properties of interactions that lead us to talk this way, what do you think philosophers would make of that? We're actually got a very different kind of handle over these kinds of issues than philosophers have. They almost talk as if free will and freedom and these kinds of things are independent of behaving organisms and are also independent of verbal behavior. As behavior analysts, we're obligated to start asking where the words came from, how they get established, what kinds of stimulus properties set occasion for them. It's a very different way of tackling these kinds of things than just sitting in an armchair. And look, they all depend on the research, generating these kinds of things, going out, asking people questions about what they call certain kinds of interactions. So now let's, at this point, we've already talked about some of these things, but let's get back to some of the places we mentioned at the beginning: free will versus determinism. Okay, consider an array of choices ranked in terms of preference for one alternative or other. Here the most preferred, here the least preferred. As far as we're concerned, that's not whether we're talking about colors, edibles, music, mates, whatever kinds of things. You could rank all of these things. And at one end of the continuum of pairs of alternatives, we could have some in which the first one is always preferred to the second, and the other end, those in which the second is exclusively preferred to the first. So if we had choices and we were trying to predict things, so we're moving along a continuum. If we're at this end of it, you've got a high probability, you can highly predict that this is going to be chosen. You get to the middle, it's about 50-50, and you get to the end and the other one is chosen. Now, if you get to the middle, preferences now are approaching indifferences. And so it's reasonable to say that if the difference is very, very small, the less strongly the chooser's selection is determined. I'll give you an example, by the way. When Darwin returned from his trip on the Beagle, in which he visited the Galapagos and he came back, he ended up having to decide whether he would get married. And he made up a list. And on one column in the list were all the reasons not to, and on the other column, all the reasons to get married. And in the end, he concluded that that all of the items on the list in favor of it outweighed all of the items at the other end. Anyway, so there was a case in which at some point it was a balance in which there was some probability he might have chosen one alternative rather than the other, but he did come down on the side of getting married after looking at all the things on the list. But you can imagine a list in which the stuff in the two alternatives involve benefits and disadvantages on each side such that you can hardly tell the difference, especially since you can't predict a lot of things. You don't know how all things will work out. If the preferences become about equal, and barring that you get some new information, you'd say this is where our choices are most free. Because if Darwin's choice wasn't free completely, because there were things on the positive side of the list in favor of his getting married that weighed enough to that it moved him in that direction, and to that extent, because those alternatives weighed more heavily with him, his choice was determined by the more positive valence of those alternatives. So what do we do in the case where they're essentially indistinguishable and we can't even tell the difference between one or another? That's the point at which you might as well flip a coin. So now if that's what it takes, if it takes for it to be undetermined, to not have things involved in the alternative consequence of picking A to the consequences of picking B, if there isn't something that tilts the scales one way or another, at which point it becomes determined, then you might as well flip a coin. How much is freedom worth? If that's what it boils down to, you might as well flip a coin. Being determined where the outcomes are something important, like whether or not to get married, is something where you might not want it to just be a matter of chance. Now, there's also another, I mean, you could then come in and say, well, wait a minute, all the stuff about determinism, we've now got quantum mechanics and all of the stuff that comes out of physics that tells us that that when we get down to the level of particles, they are not in any particular place. We can't measure them. There's no way they're determined. They're only determined after they've occurred. So if you want to point to quantum physics to argue for free will, and by the way, there are some physicists who've done that. They've gone from talking about quantum mechanics to start talking about quantum effects inside the brain. But those quantum effects are so tiny that it's hard to imagine how probabilistically they could affect events on a larger scale. A quantum event occurs, it's not going to change when a neuron fires, because there are many, 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 many billions of particles even in a single neuron. And certainly they're not going to tell us when or affect when a response is emitted. So there's one argument, there's an argument for probabilistic determinism. It's that the statistics, if you take the cumulative effects of quantum events, are such that once you get to the human scale, once you get even to neurons, they might as well be determined, because all these individual probabilities average out statistically, and no one particular one of them is going to have an effect. Now, you may see this as being similar to an argument we can make about predictability. So you have chaotic systems, the weather, you know, the business of the flap of the wings of a butterfly is going to change things just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, but if you multiply it over time, it can change where a storm system will go 2 weeks from now. And by the way, it is because of those kinds of um, the kinds of mathematics that's involved in weather systems that we can't make predictions because there's just too much going into it, and the result of each calculation affects the next one. Uh, but it doesn't mean they're not determined. It just means we're not going to get anywhere trying to predict any of them. I think when it comes down to it is, as far as our behavior goes, it hardly matters. If the only time we need to worry about it at our human scale is to the point where we get that we might as well just flip a coin, it's not anything that should let us lose sleep at night about worrying about it. Well, um, now at this point, having said this much, Nuringer has actually written about it himself. And again, let me remind you, for those of you who have downloaded the PDF of the talk, there's a list of references. You can find citations of just about all of the kinds of things I've been talking about there, although it just occurs to me that there is no citation here for the work on probabilistic determinism, but you can find some of that by one of the people who's written about that is Moxley, M-O-X-L-E-Y. And there's a fair literature there if you're interested in pursuing that. Some of it in places like the Journal of Behavior and Philosophy. So let's get back to Nuringer summarized this in a recent paper that talked about the results of these experiments in which he had people making judgments about what it took for them to call things. The operant, and now this, notice the important thing about this is he's tying together the language of the operant, our fundamental unit, and tying it to the whole concept of volition, which to me is a kind of a marvelous jump. The operant has characteristics commonly attributed to voluntary action. Operant responses are goal-directed and consequence influenced. He's not saying that the future event is going to determine something that hasn't that's happening now. Something in the future can't be a cause of something that's happening. Something that hasn't happened yet can cause something that's happening now. But something that's had particular consequences over time can be talked about as influenced by its consequences, of course, and it's just part of our human verbal behavior. When we see behavior that tends to produce certain outcomes, to say that it's goal-directed. So this is again a verbal behavior question. This describes not only the type or quality of the operand, but also the predictability of operant instances, because operant instances vary. That's in their nature. And what he found, by the way, in those experiments he did is that total randomness and total predictability were not as likely to cause a statement about, oh yeah, that there's some volition in there, but it was intermediate levels of predictability that were more likely to get people to talk about this as being similar to what we call voluntary action. So probability can vary from repetitions to total randomness, and it does so functionally. It does so because of the consequences that these distributions have. If you reinforce variability, you get variability. If you reinforce stereotypy, as Schwartz did, you get stereotypy. But since you don't see that in environments, there's a tendency to say that makes it look, you can't find a stimulus there because the response is varying too much and you can't correlate it with something in the environment. So it appears to be internally controlled. So it thus satisfies, according to Nuringer, three criterial aspects of volition. Appearance of control from within. That doesn't mean it's not uncaused. It just means that the source of the variability is not in the environment. It's somehow in the organism. It's got to have something like goal directness or influenced by consequences. And it's got to be more or less predictability, where that predictability depends on circumstances. He concedes, I present an unusual view of the operant, unusual in that it highlights direct control of unpredictability by reinforcement contingencies. And that's, to me, a really significant statement. The direct control of unpredictability by reinforcement contingencies. Narendra went off and did other things. I showed that people can be very, very good at generating random numbers, generating sequences of numbers that satisfy all kinds of tests for randomness. We tend to sort of underestimate the number of repetitions that can come up in a random, produced by a random process, like the number of successive coin flips. But people can learn to get better at it. And so even unpredictability is something we humans can learn how to do, and rats and pigeons. So if free will matters much, sorry, let me start that again. Actually, really make sure my throat keeps working. Excuse me. If free will matters most, when we couldn't do much better than leaving the choice to a coin flip, how much should we worry about it? Maybe we ought to worry about it just enough to see how choices are consistent with Neringer's way of talking about operants and volition. I recommend that to you highly. Let's have another poll question now.
Okay, everybody. Go ahead and take some time for this one.
Remember, it's not one of his criteria. It's not.
Alrighty, thank you all for voting so quickly. I will shut this down in just a few seconds. Alrighty. So it looks like 24% said appearance of control, 13% said goal-directedness, and 11% said predictability, 52% said stereotypy.
And the majority again has it, because stereotypy is not on his list of 3. That was a tough one. I was tempted to say good job, but then I'm reminded that some research I was involved in with Nancy Neef on the behavior of teachers in the classroom argues that specific praise, like your answer to that question was correct, or I compliment you for getting that question right, is much better than good job. And the reason is simple. It's that when people say good job, when teachers say good job to a class of students, the students pretty much learn that the student wasn't necessarily paying any attention to their behavior. It might have been paying attention to the behavior of a couple of the kids in the class. But the teacher is paying attention to your behavior if the teacher says, that answer you just wrote has such and such a quality. And so I try to avoid saying good job these days ever since we got those findings, because actually what happens is the generality of good job and its non-specificity, the fact that you've learned that the person saying it isn't necessarily paying attention to your behavior takes away a lot of its effectiveness. So, so I won't say good job, but I'm still pleased that the majority of you folks got these. And I will be looking for that in the future with poll questions. We have, we're getting close to the end of the hour, and we'll have a little time to go on beyond that, but we have a few other things I'd like to talk about. Let's talk now about, since I opened up early on by mentioning Chomsky and his review of Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, let's say a little bit more about Chomsky. Chomsky's birthday, by the way, is on Thursday. He will be 95. Some people celebrate that as Chomsky Day. But anyway, even after he wrote his scathing 1959 review of verbal behavior, Chomsky wasn't finished with Skinner. His assault continued in a subsequent review in the December 20th, 1971 issue of the New York Review of Books, in which he presented an extended diatribe on Beyond Freedom and Dignity. One of the telling passages is the following. This is now Chomsky writing. As to its social implications, Skinner's science of human behavior, being quite vacuous, is as congenial to the libertarian as to the fascist. Well, at least it's congenial to the libertarian, and there's got to be all the people in between. If certain of his remarks suggest one or another interpretation, these, it must be stressed, do not follow from a science any more than their opposites do. I think it would be more accurate to regard Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity as a kind of Rorschach test. The fact that it is widely regarded as pointing the way to 1984 is perhaps a suggestive indication of certain tendencies in modern industrial society. There is little doubt that a theory of human malleability might be put to the service of totalitarian doctrine. It was something like this stuff that seemed to come up in Schwartz's political positions that led him to do his research on stereotypy. And Schwartz also wrote about assembly lines and industrialization and so forth as creating stereotypy. But you notice he said it is widely regarded as pointing the way to 1984, referring to, of course, George Orwell's book, when in fact he's writing this review right after the book came out. It's hard to know how the book could already be widely regarded as having that effect if hardly anybody had a chance to read it yet. Presumably he got a pre-publication copy or certainly wrote his reviews soon after the book appeared. So he invoked fascism and totalitarianism in George Orwell's 1984, and he was using the sorts of tactics which we have become familiar in more recent political times. So as I mentioned above, in the brief time between publication of the book and his review, how could Chomsky have assessed that it is widely regarded as having a certain effect? He had called this a fact, the fact that. Well, so Chomsky has this history. Now, before I move on to saying a little bit more about that and about how Chomsky's position is perhaps lightened up a bit, but these kinds of things can have longer term effects. Let me clarify some things about the relation between Chomsky's work and our work. And I want to remind you of themes that run through just about all of the kinds of presentations I've been making in this series. The distinction between three kinds of selection, I want to remind you about that. There's natural or phylogenetic selection, there's operant or ontogenic selection, and actually, I should have fixed this one. It should really be sociogenic selection. We'll put the cultural, because Dawkins' memes are, which inspired some of these distinctions. Okay, three kinds of selection: natural, operant, or whoops, sorry, or cultural selection. I'll get this fixed yet. Okay. Phylogenetic is selection by the environment of individuals from populations. In other words, it's Darwinian. The selection of populations of genes, the selection of organisms, even the selection of organ systems over time. You know, livers and lungs and those kinds of various bodily organs have been selected. Operant selection, our kind of selection, is ontogenic. It's within the lifetime of the individual organism, and it's the selection of behavior by its environmental consequences within the lifetime of the individual organism. And cultural, or now what we can call sociogenic selection, it's nice to have three parallel terms, is the selection of behaviors that's passed on from one individual to another. For us humans, verbal behavior is a lovely example of that. Now, looking at those three kinds of selection, first of all, I want to make the point that behavior is primary in all three of them. Even though we talk about evolution and Darwinian selection, species and organisms were selected in evolutionary time based on their behavior. Their skeletal system, their nervous systems, their sensory systems, they were all selected to the extent that they allowed organisms to behave, to survive in competitive environments, to find mates, to feed, to avoid predators. All of their anatomical features were in the service of behavior. Now, selection can't happen just any old way. We're not about to evolve wings coming out of our shoulder blades or third eyes in the center of our foreheads, because there are all kinds of constraints on how selection can work that depend on what the system is that maintains features from one population to the next. And those depend both on structure and on function, both on what the systems look like and how they work. And here we have an analogy between structure and function and behavior that's analogous to anatomy and physiology and biological systems. We as behavior analysts tend to be interested in what behavior does. That's what defines operant classes. We're interested in function, but there are lots of folks who are interested in structure. What sort of properties do certain stimulus classes have? They tend to call themselves cognitive psychologists. Linguists, Chomsky in particular, have stressed structure, whereas behavior analysts have stressed function. Now, if those two emphases are as different as the emphases that we find in anatomy and physiology and biological systems, then we're going to have people following those different kinds of questions in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to choose between them. Both can have can result in findings about the way behavior is, how behavior is structured, how behavior works, that are compatible with the other. And the reason I'm doing this in part is because um, time has passed since the original debates between Chomsky and Skinner. Well, anyway, as far as the, let's get back to Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Almost a decade would pass before Chomsky's impact came closer to home. Roughly around 1980, our late older son, Bill, was taking social studies courses here in Columbia, Maryland, and Wild Lake High School. He came home one day with a packet of readings, including some work by and commentary about Skinner. And he showed it to me, and the topic of these readings were supposed to cover, this was the unit on fascism that they were talking about in high school, and included in it was commentary about Skinner. And that really got to me. So I prepared some materials and sent it back to school with Bill. And based on the feedback I get, the unit was to be revised based on what I provided. But I have no way of knowing whether the changes were substantial, whether they're accurate. I don't even know whether they were temporary, or indeed whether any changes were made. Our younger son, Ken, didn't happen to take that course, so I never found out from him. But here's the point. We're talking about the 80s. The book came out in the 70s. And by that time, the word of Skinner's imputed fascism that came up in Chomsky's review of the book in the New York Review of Books had become so pervasive that it was even taught in high school courses. That's the sort of cultural direction that we are still fighting against. And now many more decades have now passed. And actually recently I had the good fortune to be invited to have 4 online discussions with Noam Chomsky, sponsored by a Spanish organization called Ingrama. And some of these are now available on YouTube. And along the way, we discussed issues such as freedom of selection. And what I was able to do in those things was to talk about Skinner in the early days, and then to tell Noam, and yeah, I know I'm name dropping now. In fact, we'll put it in here, why don't we? About some of the research on free choice and some of the work done by Alan Nuringer. And he was willing to engage with these issues and discuss them, so that times have changed. And along the way, he acknowledged that some of the structural issues that are the concern of linguistics are in fact orthogonal to the functional issues that are a major concern. He acknowledged, for example, that the distinction between cognitive competence and performance in linguistic and cognitive approaches is pretty much equivalent to the distinction that we make between structure and function, and that they are in fact orthogonal kinds of questions, and there's no reason why they couldn't coexist. Now, only the first two of the discussions that we've had are available on YouTube. Um, the third one I have looked at, and we've done a fourth. Unfortunately, we have not, and I don't know whether a fifth will come to pass, but I think at least a little bit, some changes out there, but we have a lot of work to do to move the culture. I think that to be in a position where we can say something meaningful about the importance of freedom, which might have been a thing that might have been of interest to general audiences even back in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s. I'd thought that the argument that maybe the preference for free choice is built in and not learned might have been an argument that would have been welcome in the time of the American bicentennial in 1776. But maybe the 250th anniversary would be an opportunity to get that back in. And there are ways in which we can try to get things out there that will be acceptable to the general culture, and certainly to work against any of the stuff that suggests that any of the things that we do are give aid and comfort to fascism and other extreme views. In today's political climate, that's the last thing we want to have suggested for what we do. So we've now covered all of that ground, and so now I need feedback. Time come up for discussion, but one last question for you then. Here's a poll question.
I don't have another poll question.
No, oh, really? I thought
Um,
okay, the last poll question was, I have more than one question to the speaker. I have just one question to the speaker. I don't have any questions to the speaker, and I'm just not sure. So let's not worry about it. Let's see if you folks can answer that question for yourselves. So if you have questions, you can put them into the chat, and Marissa will take a look at them and see if there are any that can be directed to me.
yeah, go ahead and take some. So far, there is none, so that's kind of a good sign. But go ahead, put questions in there while I'm grabbing on about your CEs and all that kind of good stuff. First off, thank you, Charlie, so much for doing this, and thank you everybody for attending. If you have not purchased your CEUs yet, that's okay. Go ahead and do that overnight, and I'm going to be looking at everything first thing in the morning, and then I will have instructions for your CE certificates to you by lunchtime tomorrow. If you don't need CEUs, but you need a certificate of attendance, that's going to come a couple of hours after we end here in an email with the subject line, "Thank you for attending." And within there, there will be a bright orange button for you to be able to download your certificate. But keep in mind that that is not a CE certificate, so it will not have your BACB number or any of that kind of good stuff, ACE provider info, all that good stuff. Okay, let's see. Oh, here's a question that came in. Does your book explain these ideas more extensively?
Well, the version that's available has a section on free choice. Based on some of the things I've talked about here, I am at work on a second edition, and I plan to expand on the material that's in there for the next edition. But the current edition does have some sections about these issues, and in fact, a couple of the figures that I presented are drawn from there.
Awesome. What is the publication behavior specific praise for teachers?
I'm sorry, could you say that one again?
What is the publication on behavior specific praise for teachers?
Ah, okay. Let's see. The that had I think I can come up with that if you give me a moment. Okay. this should, okay, this is, it's in the Journal of Behavioral Education. I don't have on this, I don't have the, the volume and number, but I think you can do a search. The Journal of Behavioral Education. Nancy Neef is the first author. These are her students, and I'm co-author on it, although I work remotely with them. Changing what teachers say changes what they do, increasing their specific praise of student behavior. What we were interested in was that some teachers come out of a history of having in their teachers' colleges or wherever they learned some of this stuff, learning too much about the hidden costs of reward and believing that it's still a bad idea to deliver um, so-called artificial reinforcers to students or artificial rewards. And it turns out all of that is based on misunderstandings of the whole literature. I will be talking, by the way, a little bit about that kind of stuff in the next presentation, which will be on education, be talking about education. So what we were interested in was shaping the behavior of the verbal behavior of the teachers. And what we had to do was come up with something that was specific enough for our purposes that we could do it quickly and economically for our experimental purposes to collect data on. And so the difference between specific praise and general praise turned out to be really convenient to work with. So I hope that's sufficient information. I presume that you can see it there on the screen right now and can take what information you need to find. Or my email address is catania@umbc.edu. If you can't find it, send me an email and I'll get a full copy to you. I'll send you a copy of this reprint. Okay.
Awesome. All righty, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Dr. Catania, for doing this.
Yeah, before you sign off, I just one more thing. This happened to come up by accident. I was reviewing this in preparation of this talk. I did a thing for Operants, which is an e-magazine that is produced by the B.F. Skinner Foundation. To become you could go to the B.F. Skinner Foundation website and get a free subscription to their magazine Operants. And so I recently did this paper, and Alan Nuringer and I also did an interview on this topic, so that it's, again, if you want to know more about Beyond Freedom and Dignity and some of that history, this paper is about that material. It just happened to pop up as one of the other things I had open because I'd just been using it to clean up some things here. So there you go.
Awesome. All righty, everybody. See you next month. Go ahead and sign up for January 9th webinar. Thanks so much, Charlie. We'll see you soon.
See you then. Take care and have a good holiday, whichever one you're celebrating, all the ones that are coming up, and Happy New Year. See you next time, and hope
Yes.
next year's better than it's lots of. Take care.